Hello and welcome to another episode of Haga Plays. I've previously made it clear that the Nintendo 64 is my all-time favorite retro console. What I might not have told you is that Rare are my absolute favorite developer for this system, more so than Nintendo themselves. For the 5 years that the console lasted, this prolific company churned out a whole long line of amazing games. You might think that since I have so many of their games, I'm an avid collector who's been actively trying to get them all. But the fact of the matter is that all of the games that are complete in box, plus a few more, are games I picked up back in the day solely based on reviews. In fact, of all these games, only Force Gemini and Mickey's Speedway USA are games I picked up fairly recently, and that was for a fairly cheap price. In this video, I'm going to cover all of the Rare games that I own in chronological order. This is partially done to allow viewers to see how Rare's understanding of the machine grew over the years. So, without further ado, let's do this. I'm kicking off this list with one of the last Rare games I picked up for the console. Basically, it was a couple of weeks prior to the launch of the GameCube, and lots of people were rushing to game stores to sell their N64 games while they still could. I picked it up cartridge only for the equivalent of $3. The plot in the game is really simple. An autonomous truck with nuclear weapons on board has gone haywire and is driving straight ahead of itself. If it collides with anything at all, the weapons on board will detonate, and so the player takes control over a variety of vehicles to clear the path. And the variety of vehicles is really cool, ranging from a simple bulldozer to sci-fi motorcycles to jetpack-equipped mechs. In several minigames, you even get to drive regular cars like the General Lee and the A-Team van. This is Rare's second game for the console after Killer Instinct Gold, and it kinda shows. While it has a nice aesthetic, it's still a far cry from the technical level of their later games. The vehicles handle well, and destroying things is really rewarding. The music, the sound effects, and the visual explosion effects really do a good job of making the player want to destroy more. The only way it could have been better is if there'd be a way to place the camera behind your vehicle. Seriously, if the draw distance is good enough for the replay camera, why couldn't we actually play from this angle? The missions too are highly varied, where some just require destroying everything in sight, others are more puzzle-oriented, while some don't involve the nuclear truck at all. Despite its technical shortcomings, Blast Corps is still a game I highly recommend for any Nintendo 64 collector to get, in particular now when it's still cheap. It's good fun and lots of content that'll keep you entertained for a long time. And please, 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 Microsoft, make a sequel now! Goldeneye was the very first game I picked up for the console. When I was a kid, I loved the Bond movies, so when my mom asked which game I wanted for the N64 she was getting me for Christmas, I only had to look into a catalog and see that this game exists to decide that that was the game I wanted. Most of the time when kids decide in this matter, it ends in tears. You don't have to look any further than the Angry Video Game Nerd and his videos to see that. But this is an exception to that rule. One thing that strikes you when compared to many modern games in the genre is that it's far less narrative. There's a mission briefing before each mission, as well as a 5 or so second intro and outro sequence, and between that it's non-stop gameplay. That doesn't mean that there's no dialogue or scripted events, but player control is never interrupted. While the player has mission objectives to complete, they don't have to be finished in any particular order. The level designs are open, giving players alternate paths to take as well as the option to go about the mission in a stealthy manner. The mission objectives were, in and of themselves, quite a novel idea, however it keeps getting better. You see, when players choose a higher difficulty setting, That doesn't just ramp up the enemy health and damage, it also throws in extra objectives. The game features 20 missions, 2 of which are bonus levels based on the older Bond movies, and for the time unheard of 40 weapons. Some, like the taser, are solely accessible through cheats. And yes, this game has an absolutely insane amount of cheats, including paintball mode and Donkey Kong mode. Personally, I think that modern FPS developers can learn a lot from Goldeneye. For example, the enemies in this game actually use an actual AI. And while it's not brilliant by today's standards, enemies can spawn on one side of the level and track the player down to the other. They'll do combat rolls to dodge bullets, and when suitable, throw hand grenades. Also, where modern games put masks and helmets on enemies to avoid a sense of a clone army, Goldeneye quite simply solves this by having heads and bodies as separate models, which are thrown together at random whenever a new enemy spawns. To keep this video short, I'm not going to talk about the multiplayer because there are lots of videos covering the multiplayer for this game. Let me just say that Goldeneye is one of the best known games for the N64, the best selling, and for good reason. It's an amazing game, so if you're an N64 owner, this is obligatory. Buy it, it's awesome. When I got the N64, there were 2 kart racers to choose between, Mario 64 and Diddy Kong Racing. Where Mario Kart just contains 4 cups consisting of 4 races each, Diddy Kong Racing is a much more substantial game. It was clearly inspired by Super Mario 64, as there is a hub world where players get access to all of the other in-game worlds. When winning a race, players are rewarded with balloons, which allow players to go through the door to a new level and a new race. Each game world even features a boss fight. Another standout feature is the selection of vehicles. Rather than just featuring cars, you also have the selection of hovercraft and airplanes. Power-ups in this game were completely different than Mario Kart or any other kart racer that I know of for that matter. Rather than going into a pickup box and getting a randomized weapon, there are 4 different balloon colors, each representing a different category, including shield, oil slick, rockets, and boost. For every time you pick up a balloon of the same color, you get an improved version of that weapon. In the case of rockets, you first get a single unguided rocket, then a single heat-seeking rocket, and finally 10 unguided rockets. However, going back to Diddy Kong Racing after about 10 years, I noticed that the vehicle handling is really slippery. This only applies to cars, where the level design demands players to take tight corners, which the cars quite simply don't seem capable of handling. The planes and hovercraft, on the other hand, behave how you might expect. One thing I'm extremely impressed by is that the water in this game actually has waves, which affect the vehicles that move over them. It's by no means as advanced as Wave Race 64, but as something incorporated for one of 3 vehicles in a kart game? Wow! Yet again, this is a game you really should get. More so for the single player than for the multiplayer in my opinion, but nevertheless, it's definitely worth getting. This got a sequel for the Game Boy Advance that's called Banjo Pilot, and it was later re-released for the Nintendo DS. However, I think that the N64 version is the one to get. By now, it's probably becoming quite clear that Rare were major copycats, and that their copies always end up superior to whatever they want to copy. With Super Mario 64 revolutionizing 3D gaming, Rare were inspired to create their own 3D platformer. Enter Rare's 1998 release, Banjo Kazooie. The main character, or rather main characters in the game, are Banjo and Kazooie, a bear and a bird who lives in his backpack. Banjo's sister has been kidnapped by a witch called Gruntilda, and you have to rescue her. The structure in the game is very similar to Super Mario 64, with a hub world where the players enter 10 or so different worlds, each one containing several missions to complete. Where Mario had stars, Banjo has golden jigsaw pieces. Where Mario had coins, Banjo has golden notes. No, that doesn't make any sense to me either. A standout feature is that the protagonist can visit a shaman who'll transform the duo into everything from a spider to a pumpkin. In the alternate forms, players have new abilities which allow them to solve puzzles and reach new places in the map. Even when not transformed, players would unlock new abilities throughout the adventure, ranging from the ability to spit eggs at enemies to actually flying. Because of this, players often get new reason to backtrack past levels, so they can use these new abilities to get new jigsaw pieces. The game features a great sense of humor, especially Gruntilda and Kazooie having some hilarious dialogue. While Kazooie insults everyone she comes across, Gruntilda always speaks in rhyme and is oftentimes gross. In the environments, players can stumble across Gruntilda's sister, a nice fairy who'll tell you disgusting things about Gruntilda. A pro tip is to actually pay attention because you will get quizzed on it later. No, I'm not kidding. Later in the game, Gruntilda forces the player to participate in a game show where you have to answer questions and participate in minigames. All in all, this is really a must-get for anyone who owns an N64 yet again. That's just the way it is with Rare games. If you own a console, you should buy the games that Rare made. If you don't have an N64, you can get it for the Xbox 360. It runs at a better resolution and a better frame rate, but beyond that, it's an identical version. A game that was hyped to no end but still didn't catch my fancy was Force Gemini. It's a third-person shooter where players take control over 4 members of Force Gemini: a girl, a boy, a dog, and a flying robot. Using these 4 characters, players liberate the galaxy from an empire of bug-like aliens. The third-person mechanics don't work particularly well in my opinion. Players control the characters using the analog stick and left and right C buttons. There's an auto-aim function that means that players don't really need to be pinpoint accurate when shooting enemies. However, the up and down C buttons are used for choosing weapons rather than looking up and down. This, combined with the fact that the auto-aim completely ignores airborne targets, means that you have to enter the manual aim mode to shoot airborne enemies. While you can strafe in this mode, it's not possible to walk backwards and forwards. Something I also noticed when playing the game is that it at times is quite unclear what you're supposed to do. No kidding, the lack of footage in this video is solely because I'm stuck with both of the characters I've so far managed to unlock. It might sound like I'm not too positive on this game, but it is a great title. At some point, I really do intend to play it through. From a technical perspective, Force Gemini is an absolute marvel. This game exceeds Nintendo's own estimates on how many polygons the N64 can push per second. This doesn't happen at the cost of textures because the texture work is beautiful. Also, the game features the probably first real-time shadows I've ever seen in a game. The game features some really cool lighting effects and shaders that are quite uncommon for the system. When you enter a dark space, you notice glowing lights on the main character's armor and guns, which makes me think of Gears of War. This is naturally just a superficial similarity, but it's still cool. Whether you should get it or not is completely down to personal taste. If you want to put the time in to learn the somewhat awkward control scheme in this game, then I think that it's definitely going to be worth it to get this game, especially considering that, unlike Goldeneye and a bunch of other Rare games, this is still cheap. one of the first games to use the expansion pack was Donkey Kong 64. In my opinion, this is one of the most gorgeous games on the system. In fact, I'd even say that it looks like a Dreamcast game. After looking absolutely mauled in games like Mario Party, Donkey Kong now for the first time looked like the promo art for the old Donkey Kong Country games. The textures too are very detailed, making the game look like pre-rendered backgrounds in the country games. When I first saw the screenshots for the game, I thought that it was a hoax. Surely, this is some sort of promo art, or it would be for the Nintendo Dolphin. Surely the N64 can't pull this off. But it was true, the game really did look like that, but the looks came at a price, which was insane poppin'. Basically, enemies, pickups, and even some buildings fade away when the player is further than 20 or so meters away from them. In single player, this doesn't really matter as enemies don't actually use ranged attacks. However, it completely ruins the game's 4-player split-screen deathmatch mode, as you can't really shoot or see each other. And yes, the game does contain guns. Sort of. All of the guns look like hollow logs and only fire fruits. The game features 5 different members of the Kong clan, ranging from veterans like Donkey and Diddy to new faces like Tiny and Lanky. This game has by some been called the game that killed the collectathon platformer. And while the amount of different things to collect isn't that extreme, the main issue instead lies with the fact that there are 5 different playable characters, and that players constantly need to switch back and forth between the characters to quite simply get everything you need to progress through the game. I don't just mean that players need to use the different characters and special abilities to complete puzzles. The issue is that a whole bunch of stuff is color-coded to a specific character. So even though you're standing right next to, let's say, a banana, you can't pick it up unless you have the right ape. This didn't really bother me as a kid, however, as the game is really fun to play. The level designs are great, the controls are spot on, and there's just a tremendous amount of content. The minigames are especially memorable. All in all, Donkey Kong 64 is a good game. It's worth getting, and it's available for the Wii U Virtual Console. Hopefully that's because Nintendo are testing the market to see if people still want a 3D Donkey Kong platformer, so get it for everyone's sake. After the release of Goldeneye, Rare wanted to make a new FPS, but they didn't want to be limited by the Bond license, so they created a new IP from scratch and decided to push the N64 to its absolute limit. The game uses the expansion pack to considerably improve graphics. Perfect Dark takes place in the near future, and players take control of the Carrington Institute's newest spy, Joanna Dark. Her first mission sees her rescuing a scientist working for a company called Datadyne. As the game proceeds, it becomes clear that the evil corporation is involved in a dark conspiracy which takes Joanna from Area 51 to Air Force One and Alaska before concluding on an alien world. If this sounds like a massive variety in level design, that's because it is. Perfect Dark retains GoldenEye's open level design but improves the story. While mission briefing screens still are in the game, players will now be able to follow the plot just by watching the shiny new cutscenes before and after each level. Rather than just being panning shots like in GoldenEye, these are instead fully fledged cinematics complete with voice acting. All in all, there's 30 minutes worth of cutscenes in the game. There's also plenty of dialogue during the missions, but nothing that forces players to get away from the action. The downside to all of this technical wizardry is, however, that the game at times has a noticeably lower frame rate than GoldenEye. The gun in this game are much more fun in GoldenEye and much more varied. That's because each gun has a reload animation, as well as a secondary fire mode. Each gun really feels and looks and sounds unique. The multiplayer mode now features bots and probably the most options of any multiplayer game I've ever seen. This would be an insanely long and dull video if I just straight up recite every single feature, but one noteworthy feature is that the game features bots. And not only can players set the skin and difficulty for each single bot, players can even have personalities attached to these bots, such as cowards who run away or pacifists who run up to players and disarm them. Based on all these options, Rare created a challenge mode where players got 30 ever-increasing short missions to complete. Perfect Dark is perhaps the N64 game I have spent the absolute most time playing. It's an amazing game with more content than most modern FPS games, and one I can highly recommend. There's also a remake available for the Xbox Live Arcade, which contains substantially improved graphics and an online multiplayer mode. And I'm going to be a bit of a blasphemer, and I'm going to say that that is the version to get. The most recent Rare release for the N64 that I own is Mickey's Speedway USA. It's also the last game I picked up, as I saw it really cheap on eBay. Once I got it, I quickly realized that it's clearly aimed at a younger audience than even Diddy Kong Racing. The gameplay is simpler, with no adventure mode and much more forgiving track designs. The characters in the game even apologize whenever they hit someone with their weapons. This combination of the game being aimed at a younger audience and me not picking it up until I was well over 20 means that it's actually kinda hard for me to judge. I've only spent an hour or two playing the game, and I only ever tried the multiplayer with a friend once. What I can say is that Rare definitely put a whole lot of time and effort into this game. The menus are much more polished and visually appealing than they really need to be, and wherever possible, Rare have added effects which one might not think that the N64 can pull off. It also shows that Rare learned a whole lot about the hardware in the 3 years between the two games, as characters' faces in this game alone consists of as many polygons as the whole character models and cards combined in Diddy Kong Racing. The environments too have more detail to them, but that's not necessarily a good thing. The simple textures in Diddy Kong Racing meant that you never thought about the texture's resolution, while the more contrasting and detailed textures in Mickey Speedways at times are clearly low res. Where this is the most obvious is the road texture, which basically are the textures you'll spend the most time looking at. The color palette in many of the environments is more pale, which probably is intended to look like water paint, but I find this quite unappealing. One positive thing I can say is that when compared to the very slippery car physics in Diddy Kong Racing, Mickey Speedway is much more direct. Of all the Rare games that I own, this is the one I least recommend you to get. Quite simply because it's not very challenging, it doesn't have very much content, and it doesn't really have that much pedigree. If you've got some Disney-loving kids, then get it for them, especially considering that of the bunch, this is probably the cheapest game from Rare that you can get your hands on. Probably. Don't quote me on that. So, that was my longest video yet. What are your favorite games from Rare? Do you agree on my opinion? And would you like me to make more retrospectives like this? Let me know in the comment section below. And as usual, please like and subscribe. Until next time, have a nice day.